Numbers guy.
Numbers guy. I'm
Black
numbers
Sabbath.
guy. Yeah, before I do that, I forgot I should do the Maggot Brain was 136 on Rolling Stone's list, so I'll try to add those in as well. But Black Sabbath, debut album by Black Sabbath, comes in at number 72 in the 1970s on Best Ever Albums, ranked 14 in 1970 and 284 overall. And on Rolling Stone's list, it is number 355.
All right. We're going to get you one of those old-fashioned green visors, so when you run the numbers, you look
and a
like...
cigar.
Yeah.
My wife will love that.
An
All right.
abacus.
Yeah. Black Sabbath, formed in Birmingham, England in 1968. This is the original lineup, as this is their debut album, and they stayed, all four of them were the original lineup until Ozzy left in 1979, so we have them all through the 70s. You have guitarist Tony Iommi, bass by Geezer Butler, drummer is Bill Ward, and vocals are Ozzy Osbourne, and he also played the harmonica on that one song on this album. All four of them are still alive, and they're all in their 70s, so that's good. Despite the number of drugs that Ozzy consumed, and good to see he's still around. So
there had to be some formaldehyde in some of the stuff. So
yeah. Black Sabbath started out as a couple different iterations and names before taking the name of Black Sabbath in 1969. They started in 1968 as Polka Tulk Blues Band, and then they shortened it to Polka Tulk. And at this point, the band had a slide guitarist in there as well, and a saxophonist. From two guys. Yeah,
I did not know that.
Yeah.
Two guys that they knew, that the band knew, and then they changed their name to Earth, just straight up Earth, and then they got rid of those two members because Tony said that they weren't taking it as seriously as the rest of the band members, and I think it just didn't go with the sound they were trying to capture as well. And then in December of '68, Tony Iommi left to play with Jethro Tull.
Yes, I knew that.
But then he left the Tull by the end of the month, so he was really only gone for like a month and came back.
Well, he must have listened to their albums, and in fairness, that's how I would have reacted too.
Yeah, he said he didn't like the fact that there was no real like clear leader of the band, or I guess which I guess was kind of what their vibe was.
Was he okay with the flute?
I don't know. It didn't
Rock
say.
and roll flute.
They got revenge later when they won that first ever heavy metal Grammy, right?
Yeah. So
probably the absolute worst Grammy selection ever in terms of picking a genre.
So he said, he's done with them, and he rejoined, came back to Earth, and then in 1969. While they were playing shows in England, they found out there was another band also named Earth that people were getting confused with. So then they said, okay, we need a new name. And they were inspired by across the street from where they were staying or playing one night. There was a theater showing the 1963 Mario Bava horror film, Black Sabbath. And that's where they just got their name from. They were inspired by that. And then a famous famous British writer, Dennis Wheatley. He was very prolific. He also wrote a horror story that inspired them to write the first opening track, Black Sabbath, and then they finally changed their name in August of '69. So that almost brings us up to present, but I've got a musical theory digression first. So something that is indicative or a hallmark of Black Sabbath's sound and of the metal genre in general, and that's why they are considered the first metal band, not the Beatles as Matt would have you believe, not Led Zeppelin as a lot of people, maybe proto metal, but not true metal in the way that Black Sabbath is. They used what's called a tritone especially on the opening track, but also in many songs.
That's the flat fifth, right?
Yes, correct.
That's how I've always known it, yeah.
Yep. It's also known as the devil's interval. Now, technically, this is a tritone is any interval that's not a perfect interval. And I watched a bunch of YouTube videos trying to understand this, and man, music theory is like, it's like a completely other language. Right? I was like, what the fuck are you guys talking about? And so it could be, a tritone could be the third, fourth, fifth, sixth interval on a guitar, or I guess any piece of instrument. But this one is the opening track uses the fifth, and Iommi was inspired by classical music composer Gustav Holst. He had a whole suite of music called The Planets, and this one was from Mars Bringer of War. And I sent you guys a link earlier, and it had both the Black Sabbath track and a section from the Mars Bringer of War, and you can hear the similarity when you listen to them back to back. Now it's called the Devil's Interval because back in the Gregorian chant / medieval times, ancient times before the dawn of man, and they found the tritones very dissonant sounding and causing tension. So that's why they felt like it was not not something that they probably had strict rules regarding music and stuff, and so they were trying to skew away from that. There's a lot of myths and legends saying, they refused people playing the notes and stuff, but that's all kind of like made up. There's a bunch of articles about the history of that as well that are very interesting if you want to go down that rabbit hole.
I've always attributed it to the sound that I hate so much in like medieval music that gets played nowadays, and then the Devil's Tritone, which I love. Yeah. I just feel like something evolved over time because one gives me a visceral reaction, and it's the opposite of what was supposed to. But yeah. So other tracks or notable works that use the tritone. The opening of Purple Haze by Jimi Hendrix uses that. Actually, Getz and Gilberto use a tritone in Girl from Ipanema. And the Primus South Park's theme song uses tritones. So that's probably kind of why it sounds a little discordant or dissonant to you. Plus, like the entire music catalog of Slayer, like 80s Metallica, everything. Judas Priest, like half of their catalog. Yeah. So Rush.
And also Pearl Jam, I believe, does. I saw a Strokes song that uses it that you can tell. It's widely used now in rock music. It's not this sort of like foreign, obscure concept. It's everywhere, and not just the fifth, diminished fifth. It's all sorts of music theory, different ones that you can use.
Another one that I love is Mr. Crowley by Ozzy by himself. Has tritones all over it. Yeah. Randy Rhoads is playing.
But it's definitely, I think, a hallmark of metal music. You can hear it. There's also a bunch of songs on YouTube that do people playing guitars entire songs on tritones, and it's just, it sounds like metal basically in my ear. So back to Black Sabbath. Their first show as Black Sabbath was August 30th, 1969. They were signed to Philips Records shortly after that in November, and then they released a single called Evil Woman, which didn't chart and is not on this album. The album was recorded in a single day in about 12 hours on October 16th, 1969, and they played it live. They didn't do separate instruments or anything. They basically put Ozzy in a booth and everybody else was in the same room, and they just played it straight. The album was released Friday the 13th, 1970 in the UK,
of course,
and June 1st in the US in 1970, and it reached 8 on the UK charts and 23rd on the Billboard 200, where it stayed for a full year. Now, it was not critically loved, but they sold very well. They were popular among the masses. Lester Bangs in Rolling Stone said, quote, "It's just like Cream, but worse." And then Robert Christgau called it, quote, "bullshit necromancy," and quote, worst of the counterculture. So that was some...
Thus beginning the lifelong hatred of metal by serious rock journalists.
Yes.
And I use serious absolutely as incorrectly as possible, yes.
Yep. We will be talking more about Sabbath in the near future because their next album, Paranoid, also came out in 1970 and was even more successful. And so, yeah, we got there. I got a little bit of fun facts afterwards, but... Let's go to John first. What did you think of Sabbath listening to this round?
Speaking of artists who I'm sure felt like they came out of nowhere in the era that it was there, this is, I've listened to this album a bajillion times. I don't think it's, for those that know me, but for the listeners who are listening for the first time, I don't think it's a secret that while I wouldn't call myself a
hardcore metalhead. I love metal and have for almost my entire life. And yeah, this is where metal begins, from the, as Josh was so kind to mention, the flat fifths as I know it, to Ozzy's soaring vocals, to the sort of the galloping drums that I always associate with 70s metal. And Tony Iommi and Geezer Butler can really play the guitar, but in a different way than shredders played the guitar, which I think is a hallmark of Black Sabbath. But it's ominous sounding, it's heavy, it's dark, it's all of the things that are a nice buffer. I can absolutely see why people who were looking for a certain thing in music hated it at the time. I think, though, it's a testament to how few of the people in that crowd were truly plugged into the masses, because it's funny that the masses got it so quickly, even though this isn't what you'd call a commercial sound, and yet the critics did not. And I think to this very day, there's still an element of that with metal, where it still sells prolifically, and yet to certain types of music fans, it's still a baffling concept as to why it does. But yeah, this is the beginning. This is the beginning of metal. If you're a metalhead, I feel like this is a hard album for me to talk about, because if you're a metalhead, you already know this album inside out. If you are not a metalhead, you probably are avoiding this because it's music that doesn't sound like the type of music you like, or you just need to listen to it once to get the feel for what it is. Heavy, dark, sludgy would be another word I would say, and quick. It's, in the mid-30s in terms of length, but it does not seem like it drags on forever, to me at least. So I'll kind of follow up with what you guys say, but yeah, a very, very strong recommend for me. One of the true albums that I can say is truly the formation of a new type of music that's long-lasting. In fact, you could argue metal's the only type of rock music that's still being produced in any sort of form in this day and age in 2021.
Yep. All right, Matt, what about you? Did you draw a pentagram and start praying to Lucifer?
Before I get into that, I have to give props to my brother, because if it weren't for him, I would not have been prepared for this segment, because when I started listening to our albums, I was listening to Paranoid.
Oh, jeez.
I was like, oh, Black Sabbath. And I saw 1970 Paranoid. I went there. I didn't know that this. So he's like, texts me and he goes, man, this is badass. And I was like, well, yeah, it's Black Sabbath. He goes, but I didn't know any of this. And I'm like, you didn't know Iron Man? He goes, no, I know that. He goes, that's on Paranoid. I was like, yeah, wait, what? So we were confusing each other. And then I looked through. I was like, oh, I need the other. Okay. So thank you, Mike.
I bet you wouldn't have made that mistake with the Beatles.
No, I definitely would not have. This album is definitely where heavy metal starts. The Beatles. Now, listen, I didn't say the Beatles started it. I said they kind of did a heavy metal kind of like song that was just a heavier song. But anyway, this is evil. Right, this is terrifying. That opening track terrifies me. Okay, and when you couple that, if you listen to the opening track while looking at the album cover, you're gonna have nightmares. Right, this is a terrifying album, and this is, to me, going back to talking about what we were saying with Funkadelic. This is the type of thing that I would say that people would run away from and be like, what is going on? Like, this is something that when parents hear their kids listening to, I mean, there's direct, like, my name is Lucifer, I'll take your hand. Like, he's screaming, like, oh, God, no, please help me. Then this horrible shrieking voice. This is a scary, scary album. Or at least in parts, because the funny thing is after you do the Black Sabbath song, you go into the Wizard, and that sounds like, well, this is Zeppelin, right? Now it sounds like Zeppelin. So they do kind of go in and out of the darker, like scary horror film kind of like sounds, to the more traditional, kind of hard rock that Zeppelin was doing, complete with like harmonicas and, there's guitarists in there that I'm like, this sounds like, like Jimmy Page. I really did like this record. The longer songs are interesting. It's like this is like almost like prog rock. It's like, let's just meld 3 or 4 songs together.
Yeah, I don't get
is what
why
it sounds
they do
like.
that.
Yeah, and I would say with both of them, I mean, there's parts of this album, a couple of things that I noticed. One, it's interesting how you can hear like they're double tracking stuff. So you've got 2 Ozzy voices, one in one ear, one in another, and it's he's not really harmonizing. He's kind of singing the same part, but in a slightly different way and a little bit off beat with each other, so you're kind of getting this bouncing back and forth of the vocals, as well as the guitar, which is like Yami's. Is it Iommi, right? That's how you pronounce it. So Iommi's playing like a guitar solo in one side, and then another one on another side, and they're kind of playing together. So it's a very interesting way that they produce this.
If you hear Ozzy's voice, he sings it straight, and then he does the sort of like wailing, as opposed to it like like no one knows. Like he goes up, but then the other part of it's like knows, and you can hear both pieces, like you mentioned, Matt.
Right.
That's
but I wouldn't
of Black Sabbath. Yeah,
but I wouldn't call it harmony though. He's not really harmonizing with himself.
No, it's a
right?
different sound. It's an oral sound.
Yeah. But it's cool, right? And his voice, even when he's not doing the creepy songs, his voice is just creepy. It's a very unique sounding voice, very, very metal, and you can see how that's influential. But I think on those longer songs, I like it when there's several parts where Iommi's kind of noodling just by himself, and he's doing these really cool guitar parts, and that's fine, and I do like that. But I liked it better when he was playing with the band and with the riffs, right, and the riffs on top of that. There's some great riffs in this, and I think my favorite part of the album is maybe it's the NIB song where it's like oh yeah. When they do that, I'm like, yes, like I got the horns going, and that's a very metal riff, like, you know what I mean, like I don't think Zeppelin was doing the sound like that, right? So you can definitely hear the progression going on. So yeah, they even have like the wizard in here, which is kind of like what Zeppelin would end up doing with like, I think that song actually I think I did read somewhere that's about Gandalf or something.
That's correct. Yeah, that's what Bill Ward said. It's based on Tolkien. And
see, so even so there's
Gandalf.
something about this that's just like, metal's got to be somewhat,
starting metal's obsession with the world of fantasy,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
also metal's obsession with the long song as well, as seen by the prog metal and in the late 70s all the way to now. That's the metal that kind of is carried.
Yeah, I don't, and I think going back to those long songs, I don't see how they all fit together. Like I think they would be better served as individual pieces, because I was kind of, it kind of just seemed like they just slapped them together. And it's interesting that they chose to kind of string them in a quote one long song. But that's a small criticism. I think it's not like it's a huge issue. But yeah, this album kicks ass, and it's also terrifying. So I can't stress that album cover. I hate horror movies. I've never liked being scared. I don't get the obsession with, hey, let me sit in a dark movie theater for 2 hours and get scared shitless. Like that seems like fun. Like I don't want to do that, So sometimes I didn't want to listen to that opening track because I didn't want to feel scared. So I kind of just went to the Wizard.
Oh my god!
So I was like, I don't want to get yelled. I don't want to get screamed at by Ozzy.
All right.
That happened like once, but still, like it's still. But that feeling was there. I was like, yeah, I don't want to do this right now.
Get Linus's blanket.
Song. So yeah, exactly.
That's funny. So that was filmed in front of a watermill in Oxfordshire, that cover of the album, and there's a picture on Wikipedia. It looks very picturesque outside of the album, so maybe you want to move there.
Birmingham in that era, though, was like, we talked a lot about the 70s in America, and like England was us times two in many ways, with inflation and lack of jobs and manufacturing dying like a decade ahead of when it died for us, pretty much. And that's like, it's I think a big part of understanding Black Sabbath sound is to understand where they came from as well. They just sort of were like working class dudes who their music to some degree, in the same way that the Kinks and the Who were inspired by the era that they were around, like the Black Sabbath was in their own way.
Yeah, Birmingham was a very industrial town. That's what
they doctored that photo up to make it even look creepier. Like so. Yeah. But Josh, what do you think?
I thought this album was great. I also am a fan of metal. Probably not as much as John, but I love hearing it, and I love especially when kind of the best of the more recent bands rise to the top, like Mastodon and stuff. I always kind of check them out, but they're not. It's never really in my rotation, I would say, but I always enjoy listening to it. I really get. So Matt's right. You can hear the sound of metal in that opening track, but I was surprised that I don't think I had ever listened to this album before, outside of the kind of
the well-known songs. So I was surprised at how kind of like rock focused it was, or how much it deviated or went between like blues and rock and metal on this album. It's kind of a very interesting entry point into metal too. I think this is a great place to start if you're interested in metal, because you get a little sample, and then you get some stuff that may be less intense, and then they kind of bring it back into it. So I think it's a really, really good entry point. And I think it is you haven't heard maybe the metal stuff before, but you can hear kind of their influences, right? You can see how they're like you said, side to side with Led Zeppelin in some ways, or I can actually hear a little bit of Cream too, not influence, but like sound on that song, like Wasp, Behind the Wall of Sleep, basically NIB track. I hear some Cream.
Yeah, NIB especially. Yeah.
So you can hear that kind of like they take that blues and then they just make it really hard, right? Or do something a little bit different. So I can see, you know, with all the bands that we've talked about milling around in England at that time, I can see how Black Sabbath would come out of that. I mean, besides the sound, you have the lyrics, right? Nobody else was writing about Lucifer or the occult, or just like dark sounds. You've got, you know, lyrics like "Who is this that stands before me?" and then later on says Satan sitting there smiling, or the love. You know, the NIB's long track is about Lucifer falling in love with somebody, and all of that fits into the metal mythos, right? Of devil worship and all of that stuff.
The stuff that scared Tipper Gore shitless.
Yeah, exactly.
In the 80s, yeah.
But then you have, you know, you got Ozzy playing harmonica on the one song.
Yeah.
You've got the Jews harp on that Bit of Finger track as well, which is interesting to throw that in, because we haven't heard that.
What do Black Sabbath and Leonard Cohen have in common?
I know, really. That's like an Ed McMahon number.
The essential question, week 3.
Yeah. And I hear a lot of blues, them playing blues guitar too on the back side of this track too. So it was really enjoyable. I got into it, and yeah, it's great. I can't wait to hear Paranoid again. I haven't listened to that in a while. That is like Black Sabbath proper, right? That's like what you think of when you think of Black Sabbath. So this is definitely probably an initial release album when you think about the career of Black Sabbath as a whole, because they're not quite in that full metal sound yet, but they're like almost there, and it's great.
I like the sort of the doors blowing off of the car a little bit, the rawness of it. I do like that about this album, and that's what stands out to me about this album, even compared to the rest of Black Sabbath's early catalog, is just how raw this album is.
Yeah.
You know, and like you said, Josh, it was recorded infamously in 12 hours, I think, including the production. They just double tracked it, and then they were at the pub, I think. By the end of the day is how I've always known it, right?
That's what Ozzy said. Yeah.
And I don't think he's an exaggerator either. So he's one of the few people who probably under exaggerates his life.
Yeah, and I watched a brief hour-long doc on Amazon about them, and Ozzy was very influenced by the Kinks as well. So we've got that progression of, you know, all these artists that we've listened to.
It really says how much he loved the Beatles and the Kinks, and yet I don't really hear much of that.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's so amazing that like he could be so effusive about some of these bands like that, and then like this is what the result of that is, right?
Yeah,
in a relatively quick period of time, you know what I mean? That he's able to kind of go from there to here. And I agree, John. I think that, you know, from the opening track, from the effects of the lightning storm, the thunderstorm, and then and the rain, and then like the eerie guitar part, to the end of that song, which is actually the part that I like the most, is when Iommi just goes dun 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 dun, and it picks up, and it's like it's just, and I almost want them to do that longer.
That's at the 4:30 mark. I noted that when they start that breakdown.
Yeah, I would like more of that in that song, but
well, there's also that like that racing guitar that like Iron Maiden would use like a ton down the road, just faster, sped up.
So that is clearly not Zeppelin was not doing that, at that time, so that was, so you're right. This definitely they come right at you with, here you go,
Yep.
this is something totally different. And, but it is crazy that Ozzy made that jump. But good stuff.
So a couple fun facts that are important. Tony Iommi is very important in the sound of Black Sabbath, and his middle and ring fingers of his left hand, of his fret hand, were severed off on his last day of working at a sheet metal factory. He actually said this in the doc, that it was his last day of work because he was going to become full-time musician.
Not because he chopped his fingers off, just it was, that's brutal.
So he lost like the kind of the tips of those fingers, and he created these fake plastic fingertips, like little thimbles with leather on them, and so to replace his fingers. And so that he attributes that to kind of his unique playing style. And then also he was encouraged by a coworker at the sheet metal factory to listen to Django Reinhardt, who was a jazz artist who also lost two of his fingers, but his were lost in a fire. So that was kind of a similarity there. And he was very much into like classical music as well. And so, like a lot of the artists we've listened to, of these rock artists, they were not always interested in just rock music. They were interested in other things as well.
You know what's interesting about that? Like, it's amazing how many musicians, if you look in history, like had some sort of injury like that. Mm-hmm. And I kind of attribute it to kind of like baseball, that like at the turn of the century, there were all these pitchers that had 3 fingers, or, 3-finger Brown, right? Mordecai 3-finger Brown. Then others that had like 6 fingers, and what it allowed them to do and stuff. And it's just when innovation takes over. And the story, I'll use another baseball example. The story I always use, and I'm a coach, myself, and just playing sports. I think there's a lot of over instruction and not a lot of creativity in certain pursuits, whether it be music, athletics, stuff like that. And one of the things I always heard about Hank Aaron was he grew up so poor that no one really taught him how to play baseball. So he just grabbed a bat and he just thought, okay, I'll interlace my fingers when I hit. And it wasn't until he was 18 at like spring training where somebody was like, you're doing it totally wrong.
Yeah.
And he's like, oh, and he switched it. But he attributed his incredible pull power, like his ability to pull the ball, from the tendon strength he built from holding his fingers that way. And he also thought it created like exceptional bat control. And he would, from time to time in big at bats, interlace his fingers again. And like, I just am always amazed when like you're kind of left to your own volition without people telling you the quote unquote quote right way, end quote, what kind of stuff can come out of it. And think about that. Like in today's era, would, Iommi have even thought to do that? Or would he have like looked online for something or and gotten his fingers fixed, another possibility. But, it's just, and I just saying it's very interesting how, ingenuity comes from sometimes inspired places, and you wonder how much of that is still around.
Yeah, speaking to that as well, he'd also tune down his guitars and to make the strings easier to play.
Oh yeah.
And he said in the doc that because they didn't have different gauge strings back then, like they do now, they have all different gauge strings. He would use banjo strings to play because they would be easier to play. So he'd tune his guitars with banjo strings, and then that coupled with him hitting the strings and then like bending the strings, which you can hear, like help kind of create that heavy sound as well, like holding those notes. I guess they're called open notes.
That's interesting. So would he even have come up with any of that style if he didn't chop his fingers off?
Right?
Because he was kind of forced into that situation.
Or would he have tried to play like Eric Clapton, like the Cream stuff that everybody hears? But he basically was trying to play Cream riffs, just slow and downtone. So, and that's what Black Sabbath sounds. It's not. I mean, I wouldn't go so far as to say Cream, but they suck. It's not. But I know where that came from because, but, he probably would have instead tried to sound like Eric Clapton instead of doing it a different version.
Yeah, and then they wouldn't have had the sound like this, it would have been, that's crazy. Wow. That's a good stat, Josh. That is a fun fact.
The other fun fact I have is that NIB doesn't actually stand for anything. That was kind of a placeholder song title by Bill Ward. It was originally, or by Geezer Butler, and it was originally named after Bill Ward's beard, which looked like a pen nib, so he just named it Nib, and then he added the dots in, and then when it was released in America, they took it upon themselves to name it Nativity in Black. So they made the acronym into something when it wasn't actually. So I thought that was funny. But yep, that's all I have for Black Sabbath. I can't wait to talk about more. Sounds like you guys were also positive on it.